Greetings from the IP communications and VoIP community. We're at vuc.me on the web. This is the VoIP Users Conference every Friday at 12 noon Eastern Time. We would like to thank simwood.com, who can turn you as a developer into a telco. simwood.com. Our host at PBX is on onsip.com. Web hosting for the VUC is provided by bluehost.com. And a couple of other .coms that help us with support. zipdx.com, our full-featured, full-colored conference bridge. And our local rate dial-ins provided by voxbone.com. Thanks to all those who support us, including those of you who listen and participate. Okay, everybody, thanks for joining us. This is VUC number 497. Do you believe we're almost 500 VUC sessions? And we're honored today to have Bernard Aboba with us. Bernard, thank you for joining us. It's great. You were scheduled for a while back and could not make it, and here you are for part 2.
Well, glad to be here.
It's great to have you. I want to immediately thank Emil, because Emil has arranged several really terrific guests, among which Bernard, Alex, and let's do a shout out to Robin also. Robin was a guest about a year ago. Robin, hey, Robin Raymond.
Nice to be here.
Great to have you folks. Emil, why don't I let you introduce the topic a little bit, because you're kind of responsible for this, and that way I can just listen.
Yes, certainly.
And we introduce Bernard and let him take it away.
That will be my pleasure. So I'm really very happy that Bernard is on this call. This is certainly the person that has impressed me the most with the depth of his knowledge about video routing and the problems of video communication and the way he shares his knowledge. So I'm really very, very happy that Bernard, you could make it here. We did have a little talk with Alex about a month ago about SVC and his early works on SVC, the way they use it in video and video routing that's currently being used in Google Hangouts. So this was supposed to be the second episode, and actually going beyond the scalable video coding and into the problems of video routing itself. We're going to talk about encryption. I know that Bernard has prepared some material about that, about the needs of video conferencing so that it can be truly safe and truly scalable in the same time. I'm looking forward to hearing all of this, and I would just like to present Robin as well, who with Bernard are among the people that are doing the most of the work on ORTC, the next generation WebRTC API. I'm sure that the discussion would at some point spin around that field as well. Randy, should I let you start with your traditional question?
Yeah, I guess there is a traditional question in that, and Robin probably answered this the last time he was here, but Bernard, it would be an interesting thing to get a view of how you actually got started in technology, because, you know, we were all kids at some point, and then you grew up. I mean, did you always know you wanted to be in this, or did you fall into it, or what happened?
Kind of funny. My dad actually got started with a company called Remington Rand, starting in the 1930s, which was making calculating
typewriters.
Machines. I guess they started out, with typewriters, and then they got into calculating machines, and then they started building some of the first mainframes. And so when I grew up, he was basically fixing mainframes. He started out, was born in Cairo, started out in Egypt doing this, and then came to the U.S. And so we always had computer parts around the house. So the mainframes in those days broke down very frequently, and pretty much everything broke down. So he would go out and fix all the mainframes and get them running. And so I grew up with computer parts, and so it seemed like a very natural thing when I went to college to study basically digital design and analog design. because it was something I used to go with him on calls, and he would fix televisions or computers or whatever. And we had a closet full of tubes in the house. So it was just kind of the family business.
Yeah, Bernard, it's funny because my childhood friend of like over 50 years, Bob Cohen, is in the Hangout, and he and I were building TV cameras and stuff in our basements. So this is totally, and this is tube-based TV technology.
That's right.
So it's not,
we were building,
absolutely not foreign
we were
to
also building the recorders as well.
Yeah,
Video recorders.
that's a story that's short but too long for this, but it's funny. We tried to build a VTR in 1963 or something in the basement. Right. Didn't quite work.
Yeah, really solid state technology didn't come in until really the late 60s, early 70s. So basically all electronics was pretty fragile at that time.
Oh, yeah.
And I would like to add a sub-question to that. How did you get interested in video communication?
Well, I ended up starting out as president of the UCI forum when it was formed, and it seemed, and the forum, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, was formed to improve interoperability of video communication. I actually started out, my first experience with audio-video was actually as a network operator. I was in charge of the Microsoft network when it first launched, and we did experiments with multicast audio-video. And so that was my first experience with RTP. And actually, most people don't know this because it kind of vanished without a trace. But Windows 2000 shipped with support for multicast routing as well as multicast conferencing. And there actually was a product sold by the Exchange team that actually did multicast conferencing. So that was my first experience with it. In the late 90s, I was on the M-Bone, and was actually, we were doing remote participation in the ITF at that time via the M-Bone. It's kind of funny to think about how many iterations we've had with communication, starting with multicast and H.263 and SIP and now WebRTC. Seems like every decade we change how it works completely.
Yeah,
but we still end up with a legacy from the original, right? So, you know, we still, RTP was designed for multicast, and we're still using it in WebRTC, 30 years later.
Okay, thank you. So maybe that would be the good time to start with the presentation that you have.
Okay. So let me try to figure out how to show the slides. How do I do this? Where's the sharing?
It's almost a good time to point out how useful it is on Jitsi to be able to use the Prezi presentations. But you have an icon.
It's a screen sharing icon here?
Yeah, there is a green arrow.
The second one, I think.
Yeah.
Ah, screen share. Cool.
On the left.
Very, very good. Okay,
and then you can pick the application to screen share.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'll do that, and now see the slides. Is that right? Yes? No?
We're seeing a corner.
Yes. Actually, it looks like you're on a recipe site. No, you do have the right one.
Like a slice of PowerPoint.
Well, you know what though? Yeah, you can't go into presentation mode in
can't go into presentation mode.
So you have to, well, as far as I know anyway, so you have to get rid of the left column, I guess, and then you'll be fine.
Okay, can you see it now? Or now?
Well, yeah, but we see the left.
Yeah.
Yes, no?
Much better, yes.
So you're seeing the cupcakes?
Yeah, we're seeing all the cupcakes, yes.
You could move it even more to the left and get rid of your column, but then you can't click on it. So.
Yeah, I mean, if I do this, right, does it good or bad?
It's good.
Okay. So this is part 2 of the, and what I'm hoping to do is just reprise some of the things we talked about in part 1, and then move up a bit, because as I recall, part 1 focused mostly on the bitstream aspects of this, and I'm going to talk about higher level things like video routing and encryption and stuff like this, and APIs. So a little bit of a recap on what we talked about in part 1 about scalable video coding and simulcast. a little bit about the picture. When I think of scalable video coding and simulcast, one of the aspects of it is that you're breaking up the video into multiple streams, hopefully in a way that allows the scalable forwarding unit, which we'll talk about, to forward the appropriate stream to each device. There are a few vestigial elements I'll talk about, though, that really are remnants of the way that RTP was designed mostly for multicast back in the early 90s. And so we'll talk about some of those elements and how they restrict some of the desirable properties that we might want. So a little bit about scalable video coding. I think this is a slide that I believe Alex presented in part 1, and it talks about the distinction between a single layer and the way things are coded in scalable video coding, where you have a base layer and then an enhancement layer on top of that. Now, the enhancement layer could be a temporal enhancement where you add frames, or it
I'm
could
sorry to
be,
interrupt. Are we supposed to be saying the cupcakes still?
No.
Okay.
You should be
No.
seeing a new slide. Is it changing?
No, for some reason I still have the cupcakes. Well, we all do.
Did you enter presentation mode because you
No,
can't?
yeah, there. Now it's
Yeah,
okay.
now
There we
you
go. There we
see
go,
the
change.
scalable video coding.
Yes.
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 Ah, good. Okay, so I'll stay in this mode, and hopefully everything will work well. So, as I mentioned, in scalable video coding, you have a base layer and then an enhancement layer. And the enhancement could be frame rate, which is called temporal scalability, or it could be in terms of the resolution, which is called spatial scalability, or it could be in terms of the quality or signal-to-noise ratio. So 3 widely used types of scalability. And so I think Alex went over what we gain from all of this using scalable video coding. And there's a couple of things that we get. One is error resilience. And the reason we get that is you have the ability to selectively apply either retransmission or forward error correction. For example, you could decide to protect only the base layer. And so you'll save the extra bits bandwidth, for example, of applying forward error correction to all the layers. Or you could decide to only retransmit the base layer, and it's more feasible to do that because the base layer will have a lower frame rate, so you have more time to do the retransmission. You also get rate matching because each participant can get only the number of layers that are appropriate for them. For example, a mobile device could get a lower resolution and a lower frame rate, whereas if you have a fully functional PC or a telepresence system, you could get all the spatial and temporal enhancement layers. And of course, as a result, higher resolution and higher frame rate. You get personalized layout because, for example, on a mobile device, you could get a layout that's more appropriate for the device, which is similar in concept to the rate matching. You get lower delay because the scalable forwarding unit is only forwarding and dropping. It's not doing computationally difficult tasks such as compositing, taking a bunch of video streams and outputting a single stream, or transcoding. So it does a lot less, and the delay is a lot lower. And that's particularly good if you're trying to host this scalable forwarding unit in the cloud, where you have to take into account the additional transmission delays that would occur from that. And so if you want to keep with a good delay budget, it's good to be using an SFU.
Maybe just a quick reminder. An SFU. Would you say that it's fair to compare that to a video router?
Yes, it's a good comparison, and we'll talk more about that. In that a router, of course, well, there are a few distinctions which we'll talk about. In that a router typically, A, is stateless, and also doesn't typically parse the packets completely that it forwards. A video router, as we'll talk about, does have to actually parse the payload, and as we'll discuss, there are some very undesirable aspects of that, and that hopefully we can fix going forward. But yeah, I think in principle and really desirable to make it as much like a router as we can.
Thank you.
So a bit about the distinction between scalable video coding and simulcast. So in simulcast, we have multiple complete single streams. So, and actually, let me clarify a little bit. When we talk about simulcast, generally what we're talking about is an end host which sends multiple streams to the selective forwarding unit, but receives only one stream at a time from the selective forwarding unit. So simulcast is inherently asymmetric in that you'll be sending multiple streams but receiving only one. And there are a couple of effects that you have from that. One is that in simulcast, you're sending more bits than you would if you were using scalable video coding. But you're potentially receiving less bits. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's the case. But in general, as compared with scalable video coding, you'll have more overhead when you're sending between the end host and the SFU. It says here, from Alex's slide, about 50% more than if you were just doing a single layer, because you're sending two streams, the high resolution in this case and the low resolution. Whereas the scalable video coding is sending the base layer and the enhancement layer, and as a result, it's less overhead than the simulcast case. But between the SFU and the end host, in the case of simulcast, you'd be only forwarding one stream. For example, you'd forward either the high resolution stream A or the low resolution stream, but not both, never both. Whereas in simulcasting, you could, in fact, be getting multiple layers from the SFU. So it's important to understand that in terms of bandwidth, simulcast from the SFU to the client is actually more efficient, but it is less efficient going from the client to the SFU. So a little bit about the pros and cons of SVC. As was mentioned, SVC has about 20% more bits than the single layer case, but that doesn't count the gains that you might get from only applying forward error correction only to the base layer. So it's actually, the deficit is less than 20% in practice. And of course, there's also resilience benefits from doing scalable video coding, as Alex mentioned. And as I said, there's more bandwidth from the SFU to the client than simulcast. Now, another con is that, at least as it's been done to date, scalable video coding is not codec independent. That is, the video router needs to actually parse the codec payload, whereas in simulcast, that isn't the case. You can just forward it without parsing. And we'll talk a little bit more how that problem might be fixed, but that's the way things work today. And the pros is, as Alex mentioned, you get superb error resilience, can potentially tolerate up to 20% packet loss and still function, which is pretty remarkable. And it also has less bandwidth from the client to the SFU compared with simulcast. So some other benefits of scalability. It matches the WebRTC environment extremely well, and I'll talk about why that's the case. For one thing, of course, WebRTC can be used on any scale of device, from a mobile device up to potentially, I think, even a telepresence system. And so having the ability to adapt to the device is pretty darn useful. But also, it's very, as we mentioned, the SFU can be hosted in the cloud. And that can really occur in one of two forms. You can either run your SFU in a virtual machine, or you could potentially have a multi-tenant SFU where you have one big SFU which is being used by multiple tenants or multiple users at a time. Scalability is already in H.264 SVC, which is the most widely applied version of it, but it's also supported in VP8 through temporal scalability. Temporal scalability isn't turned on currently within WebRTC implementations, but the code is there and it could be turned on, and hopefully will be turned on at some point once we have an API that can do it, and Robin and I will talk more about ORTC and how it enables that later on. And then it is built into HEVC, H.265, as well as H.265 SVC. So because of all that, really I think scalable video coding is on the verge of becoming a mass market ubiquitous thing in all of the widely deployed codecs. And of course, we'll also be in VP9.
And Bernard, when you say that the SFU is very suitable for the cloud, why isn't that the case for the MCU?
Yeah, that's a great point. The SFU, because it's only doing things like forwarding and dropping, has much lower latency. And so, as an example, if you were to host an SFU, for example, only in a few data centers around the world, you would be able to tolerate the latency of traveling to that data center and back. Whereas if you're doing something computationally intensive thing like a transcoding or a compositing, you're going to have a lot of latency involved in that operation. And so, for example, you might be consuming 150 or 200 milliseconds just in the transcoding operation or in the compositing. And then if you had an additional, say, 100 or 200 milliseconds on top of that to get to and from the data center and process things, your latency budget would be really high. And so things wouldn't work that well. Whereas if you're in an SFU where the overall latency of just the forwarding and dropping might be 10, 20 milliseconds, you're going to be able to handle the data center latency as well. But in addition, you'll notice that if you start running these SFUs in virtual machines, because of the additional latency, for example, that you'll get in a VM, things actually won't work that well if you're doing the compositing or the transcoding operation. You'll see glitches potentially, whereas things will be very smooth if you run them in a VM and you're running the SFU concept. So yeah, and you can see this for yourself. Of course, Emil, you've run Jitsi Video Bridge in a lot of different VM environments, and of course it works pretty well. It's interesting when I talk to people about this, they're often very skeptical about it, and then you can show them something like Jitsi Meet, and they go, oh yeah, it works. You can wave your hands, of course, in the video, and things are very smooth. You would think that something like Hangouts would have kind of given people an idea that, yes, you can do this, but it really does help to be using a scalable forwarding unit. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. So then people ask, who is using this? And the answer is it's actually very widely deployed today. It's in products from Cisco, Google. Hangouts, for example, uses scalable video coding today. Polycom, Microsoft, that includes Lync and Skype as well, and the products from Vidyo. Many others are also using SVC, and certainly as this rolls out more widely into other codecs, I expect the usage will only increase. So the overall message I'd like to get across is because the SFU has fewer moving parts, it's really a more desirable way of handling video. This particular picture is of an Eastern European cabaret from the 1930s transported to a tent in Seattle. And it just suggested a lot of complexity which the SFU doesn't have. And so maybe you could redo this little cabaret in a simpler way, and it might not be quite as elegant or interesting, but might work better. So a little bit about the selective forwarding unit, or SFU, and its operation. The VR here is for video router, which is another way of talking about it. And here what we see is multiple participants, each with two layers, a base layer and an enhancement layer. And then the video router is going to decide for a given participant which of these streams it's going to forward. So for example, it might forward a base layer and enhancement layer from one participant, but maybe only the base layer from the other ones. And so altogether, that individual receiving the streams would have a set of streams that are targeted to their environment, to their screen size, to the available bandwidth, and so forth. So a little bit about the terminology that we use in describing these selective forwarding units and media-aware network elements. So the first element of terminology was something that came out of RFC 6184. It defined the term main, which is still one of the most popular terms that's used. And the definition is as follows: a network element, such as a middle box or application layer gateway, that's capable of parsing certain aspects of the RTP payload headers or the RTP payload itself and reacting to the contents. It can drop packets or forward them. It's also aware of the signaling. It has to be aware of at least, that doesn't necessarily mean it has a signaling parser like it can parse STP, but it has to be aware of the configuration of the session because it has to know what ports are being used, what payload types each of the participants expect, and stuff like that. It also has to be trusted when working with SRTP. And I'd like to particularly hone in on those two statements, or the RTP payload, and has to be trusted when working with SRTP. This is true of the way SFUs are designed today. Mains and SFUs are designed. It isn't necessarily a desirable characteristic. Either of those two things really aren't that desirable, for reasons I'll talk about. Now, people ask, well, what's the distinction between a main and a selective forwarding unit? Well, a main may do things such as now repacketization and an SFU would not. So think of an SFU as really something that purely selectively forwards. A main can do a few other things like repacketization of now units in addition. So an SFU is really a subset of a main.
And would you say that a main is basically just more aware of the specifics of a codec?
Well, it can do, let's just say it can do additional operations rather than just selectively dropping and forwarding the frames as they come in. It can rearrange them, such as this stuff like now repacketization. Now, of course, when you start doing things like that, you add to the latency. So you really need to think, is this operation absolutely required or not? And an SFU would basically say, no, I'm just going to forward and drop. I don't want to, because of course, if you're doing things like now repacketization, you also now have to understand the now unit organization, which means you lose any codec independence that you would have had. So there's real downsides to getting into some of that codec payload. And among other things, you realize once you do that, you become essentially a decoder of a particular codec, which means that every time a new codec comes along, you have to add code to your SFU to handle that particular codec. And as we've just talked about, it started out with H.264 SVC, but we have VP8, VP9, H.265. So if you're going to build an SFU that handles all the codecs coming down the pike, that's a lot of very codec-specific work to do, which customers may not be willing to pay for. Right? If you can get out of doing a lot of that work and not have to revise your main every time a new codec comes down the pike, you're probably better off in terms of your maintenance. So just something to think about. But I want to get into, in particular, the two statements in red, because I think they're questionable, and we may have to rethink about whether we really want the SFU to be doing that stuff. So if I were a skeptic or somebody who hadn't looked at this, I might have a few questions. And one of them is, this sounds like a router that can only forward packets that it understands. We talked about the fact that it might have to parse the codec. So what if I offered you a router that couldn't parse HTTP and therefore couldn't forward HTTP packets? It's also, as we described, something that has to be trusted. So what if I had a router that needed to be able to decrypt traffic in order to forward it? So I'd say, sorry, Emil, my router can't forward your SSL/TLS packets unless you provide me with the keys. Or because there's so many options here, what if I had a router that could only route packets sourced by compatible hosts? And I went around trying to get all you folks to install this router. I think I'd be fair to say that it would have limited popularity. The routers we have today don't have any of these limitations. So when we call this a video router, we should be cognizant of the fact that at least the way they've been built today, they don't really function with the generality of today's IP routers. And that's a little bit of a problem. And so we'll talk about some of the issues that come up with that. So with respect to the problems that we have about only being able to route packets from compatible hosts, there's obviously a need for some profiles and interoperability work here. And so two things I'd like to point out. One is work done by the UCI Forum, which is soon to become part of IMTC because they're merging, to provide profiles of H.264. And it started out with work on the H.264 SVC bitstream to provide a profile of that. That work was finished in December of 2012. And then it went on to provide a profile of SVC transport, which was completed in June of 2014. Now, with respect to signaling and SDP, it was found there really was no common ground. There were, in fact, no ITF standards general enough to handle all the H.264 SVC transport modes in particular, and so they were not able to come to agreement on a profile for that. Now, in addition, there's some next generation specifications focused on HEVC or H.265. The video working group is chaired by Alex, and they're going to work on the bitstream of HEVC. hopefully the HEV transport spec is now improved enough that they won't have a lot of the issues with the transport that they had with H.264 SVC, but we'll see about that. And then I chair what's called the main working group, which focuses on the higher level stuff such as the signaling, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Now, in addition, I think there's that the WebRTC work could have a lot of positive influence because, of course, in WebRTC there's really an expectation that the browsers will interoperate and that you won't need an SFU for every kind of browser. And so, in particular, there's this RTP usage profile document, which I think could end up being quite useful in helping mains operate across a range of codecs. And there's also a video document which may help with that in specifying some of the aspects of the video codec operation which are expected within browsers for things like H.264 and VP9 at a minimum. So I want to talk a little bit about transport terminology in terms of the selective forwarding unit. There is a concept introduced in 6190 of single session transmission versus multi-session transmission. And really this is about whether you use single RTP sessions for transmission of all the layers or multiple. So what's an RTP session? It's really a single session is where you transport the RTP to a single IP address and port. So if you're using single session, it means all of the layers go to a single address and port, or if it's multiple sessions, then typically it would be the same IP address with multiple ports. And there's an additional concept of whether it's single stream or multi-stream. So in single stream, it's within each RTP session you use a single SSRC. So in the RTP packet, there is something called the SSRC, which is an identifier of a source. And so even at an end system, you can have a single IP address, but you could, for example, have multiple cameras, or you could have potentially multiple layers coming out of that end host, and so you want to have different source identifiers for the layers or for the different cameras. And so a few things about the distinction between single stream and multi-stream. Generally, simulcast does not use single stream, so you have a different SSRC or source identifier for each simulcast layer. So that would be multiple stream. Also, when you use single stream, your sender reports or receiver reports provide cumulative information across all the layers. So you would, for example, put together all your receiver report information across all layers, and you couldn't tell, therefore, whether the losses that you incurred would be in the base layer or potentially in the enhancement layers. Whereas in multiple stream, which is really required for simulcast, you can have your sender reports indicate the packets and octets sent for each layer, and then the receiver reports can indicate the reception statistics for each layer. The other thing which is nice about multi-stream is that it is possible to use some of the RTCP control information on a per layer basis. And an example of that would be the TMBR message, which is basically a bandwidth limitation message sent by the receiver. And that could be used to pause or resume individual streams. So for example, the SFU could send a timber message of 0 to say, hey, don't send me this layer anymore. So that would be useful, for example, when an end host was sending a high definition stream and a low definition stream, and it turned out that the SFU didn't have any participant who could handle the HD stream. So it could just tell the end host that don't send this HD stream anymore, I don't need it. And then if someone came on who could use the HD stream, it could send a resume message and have it get going again.
Bernard, would it be fair to summarize this as basically saying that when you're doing single stream, it's as if you have one pipe from your browser to your video router, and then from the video router to the other browser, and then basically what the video router sees is just water flowing through that one pipe, and it can't really control it in any way. Whereas multi-stream would be as if you have a thinner pipe and a bigger pipe, and then the video router sees both of them, and then depending on what the receiver can handle as debit, it can either block one of the pipes or pass them both, or whatever it needs to be done, and it has basically more control. Would that be a fair resume?
Well, in either case, either single stream or multiple stream, the video router has the ability to drop packets. But the amount of work needed when you drop is less in multiple stream, and let me talk about why. So in a single stream of RTP, we have what's called a sequence number. And if you start dropping when you're in single stream mode, you then have to rewrite all the sequence numbers. You still have the ability to do it, of course, and the implementations do that, but they now have to rewrite all the sequence numbers, whereas in multiple stream, because the sequence number space exists only for a given SSRC, if you stop forwarding for a given SSRC and keep the others there, you don't have to rewrite the sequence numbers on the streams that you forward because they still make sense.
Okay.
I should also mention that an SFU could rewrite the SSRC field either in single stream or multiple stream. And so a lot of the other aspects of the header manipulation are the same, but you save the expense of the sequence number rewriting if you use multiple stream.
And just to clarify,
there are little complications of the multiple stream, I would also add. Because you have a multiple sequence number space in multiple stream, you need something called the decoding order number. And basically it tells you how to on the decoder what order to take these multiple streams in. And so you'll see if you read the H.264 SVC spec, there is this thing called the DON field, the decoding order number field, that you need to support if you do multiple stream. And one of the reasons we have interoperability problems today between single stream and multiple stream implementations is that many implementations of the single stream do not support the DON field. And so actually the packetization of H.264 SVC is different depending on whether you do single stream or multiple stream, and that causes endless problems. So anyway, go ahead.
So Bernard, one thing that's important to clarify, the reason why it's important not to change the sequence numbers is because the moment you do, your SFU must have the keys to be able to decrypt the stream.
Yes. And
that is not desirable.
Well, in fact, this is true, it turns out, if you change any of the RTP header fields. So as an example, because SDP, of course, you can end up with different payload types for the different participants. The SFU might have to change the payload type field. It might, for example, need to change the SSRC field because it's allocating its own SSRCs so as to avoid having to hack the RTCP messages, which it would originate itself. We just talked about the sequence number. And so there's an endless number of ways currently that you could have to be forced to decrypt the packet and re-encrypt it in SRTP as it exists today. Basically, if you touch any of the RTP header fields, including the CSRC field, then you're kind of you broke it, you own it, and you have to decrypt and re-encrypt the packet. So we'll get into more about this later, but it's one of the undesirable side effects. So a little bit about the transport taxonomy, and so you can have this combination of the streams and the sessions in the following four ways. You can have single stream transmission with a single session and single stream. That means all layers are sent within a single RTP session using a single SSRC. That also implies that all the layers utilize the same payload type. You can have a single session.
It's good pointing out that this is what is currently happening here, because I believe that's how the video router works in Google Hangouts.
Yeah, I would say most implementations are SSTSS. For example, I believe all implementations of VP8 temporal scalability are SSTSS. Most implementations of H.264 SVC are SSTSS. So it's definitely the most common mode. The next most common one is SSTMS, where all layers are sent in a single session, but they utilize distinct SSRCs. This is basically what we do in Lync. And here it is possible, although not that frequently implemented, that each layer could utilize a distinct payload type. An example would be an H.264 base layer with an H.264 SVC enhancement layer on a different payload type. But as far as I know, that's not very common. Much less common is multiple session transmission, and we have multiple sessions are utilized potentially with a single SSRC for the MSTSS mode. And then finally, the most complicated one would be the MST-MS. We have multiple RTP sessions, and each of those sessions utilizes multiple SSRCs. And as far as I know, I don't know of any implementations of this, and it may not make any practical sense to get to that level of complexity.
So before we proceed, what's your favorite of these four? What would be the most?
Well, I happen to like the
future-proof?
SSTMS, which is what we do. For some of the reasons Robin talked about, you don't have to rewrite the sequence numbers, and also when you do the RTCP reporting, you now can have control messages and report messages for each of the streams. So it gives you more information. It seems more natural the way RTCP works, because you can get your loss reports and send the reports for each of the streams. And you also, in the future, as I'll talk about, have the ability to do control for each of the streams. And that can become particularly valuable if we start moving some of the control functionality up from the codec into RTCP. That could be a pretty big advantage. So I think my sense is when we talk to codec implementers, they're beginning to see the value of SSTMS. But of course, the implementations today are primarily SSTSS. But great question. So a little bit about SFU taxonomy. As I've talked about, there are a lot of SFU implementations today. Unfortunately, they operate pretty differently, and there's a lot of dimensions in which they differ. And one thing, the things that Alex and I are thinking of doing in this main task group in UCI Forum IMTC is to try to get an inventory of what everybody does and try to understand maybe what the commonalities are and drive them more towards that. So one of the dimensions of difference is whether the SFU terminates RTCP or not. Now, as far as I know, all the current implementations do this, because the only alternative is that you'd have to rewrite RTCP fields coming from the participants to make sure they make sense. And the reason why you have to do that is that your end host might be sending you more layers than you forward. And so you don't want to just forward their sender report claiming that they sent all these packets that in fact never got to the participant because the SFU dropped them. So really the SFU would have to modify the information in that sender report if it were to keep the SSRC the same. But often it's just simpler to just throw that stuff away and send your own RTCP sender report with your own allocated SSRC. The other dimension of difference is whether the SFU supports simulcast and or SVC or both. And one thing is if the SFU supports only simulcast, then it need not decode the payload. Because essentially it knows everything it needs to know about that stream just from the signaling. And therefore that saves you the ability to have to decode the SRTP. So that's one significant advantage today. And then the other is the transport. Which transport modes do you support of the ones we just described? And then yet another dimension is whether you do switching or not. So an example would be, say you have a really large conference, like 50 users or something like that. You might not want to forward the packets from all those 50 people just to save yourself a little effort. And so would you combine participant selection, like looking at the active speaker or a set of previous active speakers, with selecting the streams that you want to forward? So you could combine those two, and for example, if Emil right now is silent, we might not forward his video, but just the last 2 people who spoke or the last N who spoke. And another thing is if you do this switching, you might want to utilize the CSRC field, the contributing source field, to basically indicate which participants are being viewed. If in fact the SFU allocates its own SSRC, you might put in the CSRC field saying, hey, Emil is a contributor to this packet, and this is his SSRC, even though I'm forwarding under the SSRC of the SFU. So that's a reason that you might see the CSRC field show up in a video packet that's forwarded from an SFU. Typically, in today's implementations, you typically won't see the CSRC field filled in. But by the way, if it is filled in, it's yet another reason why you might have to decrypt and re-encrypt the RTP packet and recompute the message, the authentication tag. So a little bit about the SFU and how we think about it. One way of dividing this is we can think about a forwarding plane and a control plane, like in a router. And it's a pretty natural way for me to think about this. I used to work on routers in the old days. And so I like to think about these two things and compare how an SFU works versus an IP router. And some of the aspects of that comparison are not all necessarily advantageous for the SFU. So the forwarding plane would be just how we forward and drop the SRTP packets. And today that's typically based on the RTP header. Actually, I shouldn't, POXY-NAL should be considered part of the RTP payload. That's wrong. And then potentially modifying the RTP header fields as we described, like modifying the payload type or the SSRC field, or rewriting sequence numbers or inserting a CSRC. Now the control plane is the control messages that help that video router make the decision on whether to forward and drop. So that would be stuff like the TCP feedback messages, the receiver reports, for example, or actually that isn't a feedback message, report message, but feedback messages might be things like a picture loss indication or a generic NAC or a slice loss indication, something like that. Then, of course, there's also the stun, turn, and ice for the NAT traversal. There's codec-specific messages, and those would be things, for example, that the SFU might send, like an SEI layer drop message saying, hey, I'm not sending this layer anymore, or messages describing the layout of the layered codec itself. There's key management, which, of course, is necessary to get the keys where they need to be. We'll talk more about how that might work. And then there's signaling, which could be done in a variety of forms, which basically tells the SFU what to expect in terms of what's coming in on the various ports and what should go out. So a little bit about the RTP feedback messages. There's an RTP profile called AVP with feedback, which was created really mostly for video, and that's defined in RFC 4585. And it defines a couple of different types of feedback messages. One is transport layer feedback, which is really independent of the codec, general purpose messages. That includes things like the generic NAC, basically, which says, hey, I didn't get this. And then the TMBR, TMMBN, which is done for bandwidth control. And then there's payload specific, which is feedback specific to a given payload type. So in other words, in your payload type definition, you have to describe whether you use these different feedback messages and which ones you use. An example of that is the full infra request, which is typically done for video switching to make sure that you've got the iframe to use. Then there's picture loss indication, which says, hey, basically I lost this particular picture. Distinguished from full infra in that it doesn't require the sender to actually resend things. It could, for example, if that PLI referred to an enhancement layer, it could decide to do nothing about it if it wants to. And then slice loss, which basically says it lost part of a picture and describes what macro blocks were lost. And then the reference picture selection, which basically is a kind of, and can be thought of as a kind of an ACK message, which says, hey, I got the following reference picture, and this is the reference picture I'm now using. And again, this is defined by the codec itself. And then application layer, which is a special case of the payload-specific feedback. Now, one interesting thing is that today, when we look at SFUs, they tend to implement a different set of feedback messages. And this is annoying because what it means is if you have an SVC implementation, the set of feedback messages you support have to also be supported by the SFU, or maybe things might not work very well. Now, the good news is that the WebRTC RTP usage document actually has a set of requirements for what and suggestions, recommendations for what kinds of feedback messages should be supported by WebRTC implementations. And hopefully this will get some of that under control, although of course there are, as mentioned above, there are payload-specific messages, so that it depends in part on what codecs you implement. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So here's the status of where we are with feedback message support. So RFC 6184 and 6190, which are the definitions of H.264 and H.264 SVC, do actually not discuss feedback messages at all. And this is a bit depressing because without feedback messages, you've got an issue with resilience. And we are seeing implementations in the field using feedback messages, but because the specs don't tell you which ones to use, they're using different sets. So that's not so great. And hopefully the WebRTC implementers of H.264 will get their act together and have a standardized set of feedback messages. And there is a draft coming out in RTC Web which hopefully will include some of that to get that a bit more under control. Now in the VP8 document, the payload document, is discussion of some of the feedback messages. Section 5.1 discusses the use of RPSI. 5.2 suggests how to use SLI, so that's good. And then H.265 actually defines some new feedback messages, SPLI and RSPLI, neither of which are mentioned in the WebRTC RTP usage document, so that's maybe not so great. And also talking about RPSI, which is mentioned in the RTP usage document of WebRTC. So it's a little bit of an inconsistent story right now between the codecs, and this is probably one of the things that folks in the IETF need to work on to get us to a more consistent set of feedback messages that everyone can do, and therefore you could actually build an SFU that can handle all these codecs without having to add, different feedback message sets. So a little bit of a summary of what I've just been talking about, which is that scalability solves some of the fundamental problems in packet video, the error resilience issues, some of the delay issues. The SFU really is similar in some sense to routing, although not completely, as I've talked about, in improving the ability to scale, have lower delay, and decrease the amount of complexity involved in handling video. There are a large number of design choices when you're building your SFU, and probably more than is good for the industry as a whole. In particular, some of those choices are governed by the codec, by the different transport modes, and so you could see as you make these different design choices that you could end up in a situation where an SFU could only handle a particular vendor's blend of video. And in the world that we're getting into with all of these different codecs, VP8, VP9, H.264, and H.265, that's not all that great. And we have a long way to go in terms of standardizing the signaling and control for the SFU devices. But WebRTC acts as a spearhead in that direction, because hopefully the browser vendors will get their act better together and have a set of video codecs and that look a little bit more alike than what we're seeing with H.264 out in the marketplace today. So,
can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
How do some of the other some of the walled garden type vendors, how do they solve these problems? I mean, they're sort of they have dominion over their domain, so they can essentially say, oh, this is the way we're going to deal with this, scalable coders, because to deal with network congestion. So like Skype and other sort of closed.
Well, pretty much in the world of H.264 SVC, the reality is everyone has kind of it made a bunch of design choices, and that weren't the same. And I was in the unenviable position of being the president of the UCI forum for 3 years and trying to herd all the cats. And the results were described in one of the slides, and let me find it again if I have it. Yeah, profiles. So we were able to herd a bunch of the cats as far as the bit stream was concerned, and we're able to complete that profile. And we've done interoperability tests in IMTC and so forth, and actually done fairly well with respect to the bit stream. But things began to fall apart with the transport because we had all the different modes that I described, and people did different things with that. And in the signaling, it was really a complete mess where everyone's SDP looked dramatically different. Some people didn't even do SDP. So I think the answer to your question is the cats. We had them all in a line for the bit stream, and then they ran all over the room and went all in their different directions. And customers haven't been all that happy about that, to be honest with you. And so what we've seen really is a proliferation of gateways, and some of them have to involve some heavy transcoding, like if you didn't even do H.264 SVC, just did AVC, then you'd have to transcode things into multiple layers, and that's not fun. That takes a lot of CPU. Or you could have to repacketize things in the different transports. And so we've seen a proliferation of gateways. Of course, there are a large number of cloud services that actually do interop. And so basically a lot of non-native interop issues and people kind of filling the gap. And of course that's, you might be able to tolerate something like this if you're building if you bought a telepresence system which costs a couple of $100,000. You might be willing to pay for a gateway, but you certainly don't want to have a gateway when you're dealing with browsers. People expect that to be kind of easy and inexpensive. So I think the answer to your question is things haven't gone all that well, but people aren't all that happy with it, and I think there's a fair amount of consensus that the situation is intolerable when it would come to WebRTC. And so that's part of what's been happening with things like the RTP usage profile, is we're starting to get a little bit of more cat herding going on, although I think probably we need a bit more because, as I mentioned, the codecs themselves are disagreeing on things like the feedback messages. Maybe we need a little bit more herding there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even at any price, essentially there's a performance penalty. Even if those infinite number of cores, CPUs that cost $0, you still can't. If I'm understanding correctly, you still can't essentially effectively deal with the the performance degradation of having to schlep those media streams all the way over to someplace far away at the cost of
the really bad one is if you have to start transcoding. That's just awful in terms of its delay and new implementations. The transport repacketization isn't horrible. It's obviously not great. It can be done. People are doing it in a variety of gateways and cloud services. That is something within the capability of a main. We talked about now repacketization, transport repacketization. It's obviously real. The problem is when you start doing things like WebRTC and you're now having to pay all these cloud, fees and stuff. That's where it really becomes a very difficult thing. And people don't expect to have to do all these things for the web. But I think that's fair to say. Is they might tolerate it for a high-end system, but not for stuff that they're deploying in browsers.
Right.
So so I have some hopes, which I hope are justified, that this situation will improve fairly rapidly in the near future. Of course, I've been optimistic before. I was the person who took that job in the UCI forum and spent 3 years with limited success, so don't take my word for it. I'm kind of an optimist by nature. So let me get into another area, which I think is a limitation of the way we do things today. And that's in the area of security. And I'll try to, there are a lot of different ways of motivating this, but let me try to talk through some of the ones that I think are interesting. We talked a little bit about the fact that it's not all that desirable to have to dig into this codec payload for the SFU to operate. And some of the reasons why that's not great, one is that in the multi-codec world that we're dealing with, it implies that whenever any new codec comes out, you have to rewrite your SFU. And particularly also deal with new feedback messages and rewrite that in your congestion control. And that's really, if you think about it, that's as weird as if every time a new protocol came out, you'd have to rewrite your TCP implementation, right? Or rewrite your router. Oh, sorry, my router can't handle HTTP or can't handle this new thing. And people would look at you pretty skeptically if you said that. They'd think that you weren't engineering it very well. So that's one problem. But in particular, if you're, as we mentioned, anytime you touch any of the RTP header fields, you now not only have to redo your message integrity check, which kind of makes sense because you'd want to protect the header, but also because of the way SRTP works, you now have to decrypt the packet and re-encrypt it. And people say, well, why do you have to do that? That seems bizarre. And the answer is that when you look into the cipher suite specs for the SRTP cipher suites, they depend on some of these header fields. So, for example, the F8 cipher depends on a bunch of the fields, such as the packet type. But some of the other cipher suites, they do depend on the SSRC field. And you say, well, why do they depend on the SSRC field? And the answer is that you want to make sure that you have a unique key stream for each SSRC. And so it makes sense that things like your IV field would depend on the SSRC. So it's not necessarily, that's something that probably has to be the case, that you would have to have the stream cipher depend on the SSRC field to just make sure you're not duplicating the key stream, which could be a real problem. But anyway, it creates an issue because it means that you have to do this additional decrypt and encrypt operation, which is additional work. But the other issue there is that it implies the SFU has to have access to the decrypted media. And that becomes a concern, particularly in what we call multi-tenant operation. Now, as I mentioned, the SFU is very amenable to implementation in the cloud, but there's different ways you can do that cloud implementation. For example, you might decide, hey, my company is going to run a VM, and we'll have our SFU basically only work in our virtual machine, in which case, yeah, it's your VM, it's run by your company, and the fact that you have access to the keys might not be that big a deal because it's your VM. But if you're operating in multi-tenant operation where you're asking a provider to basically do the SFU operation for a lot of different companies, you might want to make sure that the video for your company might not be decryptable by some other company, or that the operator doesn't have access to the keys for all the companies that are using that multi-tenant. And of course, there are other concerns that might have been brought about by some of the Snowden revelations, particularly by countries that have data protection kind of regulations, where they're concerned that, hey, is this stuff being stored, and so forth. And so it's potentially a little bit better story to say, hey, I don't have these keys for that operator of the multi-tenant. I just am routing packets. For example, you wouldn't typically get an operator of a router being asked, for example, get a FISA request or something like that, because they're not storing packets, right? They just forward them. So this is a series of concerns that's come up, and I think we're going to see quite a bit of activity going on in the ITF to figure out how to fix this, and allow, if you recall back in the definitions, we talked about two things which were of concern. One was that the SFU had to parse the packet payload, and we say, hey, why do we have to do that? And the other was that it has to be trusted. And so I think we're going to re-examine that assumption that it has to be trusted and figure out, well, how can we get around that? So a little bit about that trust problem. So one question to ask is, can you build an SFU that doesn't have access to SRTCP master keys? So an SFU that couldn't decrypt RTCP. The answer to that is no, because you first of all need that RTCP info for the SFU to function. It's basic information needed by the control plane. So for example, you need to know, hey, are the participants receiving these RTP packets? Is there a lot of loss? Because you might decide, for example, to drop additional layers so as to hopefully improve the situation. And also, as I mentioned, particularly if you want that codec independence, you might want to make sure that you have the ability to do RTCP control, send these feedback messages, and so you really do need those SRTCP keys.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. So you absolutely have to have the SRTCP master keys. Can't get around that one. But the next question is it possible to build an SFU that doesn't decrypt the RTP payloads? Now, today the answer to that is pretty much no, because if you touch any of the RTP header fields, including the SSRC field, you're going to be stuck with recomputing the authentication tag, but also decrypting and re-encrypting. But, as I mentioned, this is potentially a very desirable property of a multi-tenant SFU deployed in the cloud. So, next question is, great, how do we get around this, and what are some of the issues? I'd like to put in a few caveats, which is that if you multiplex RTCP and RTP, then you have by nature linked the trust of both of these streams. Because then your SRTCP and your SRTP master keys are going to be the same because you're multiplexing. And there's no way for the SFU to avoid being trusted with the SRTP master key. So that's something to keep in mind, and particularly in the WebRTC design, we do assume that, in fact, it's required that implementations support RTCP and RTP multiplexing. And so if we want to not have the SFU be trusted with SRTP master keys, we're going to have to give that up. The other thing is if you don't multiplex RTCP and RTP, you've got some additional issues that come up with the WebRTC specs, because then you're going to have different DTLS SRTP negotiations for RTCP and RTP. Even if you keep the certificates the same, you could, and in fact would most likely have different identities for RTCP and RTP because they'd be terminated on different entities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And in the WebRTC 1.0 spec, it says those identities must be the same, but in fact they won't. and so there's an issue that will come up there. So some things to think about, either when you multiplex or you don't. Today there's going to be potentially some issues. So there are 3 drafts which you can read that have just shown up in the last week about this problem. There's 2 problem statements. Draft Matson is one of them, and draft Ismail is another, and another solution statement from which is called draft Chang. And I'll talk a little bit about how those things work. So this is an area of very active discussion at the next ITF meeting in Toronto. I believe the ABT core session will have a discussion of this, and probably will expect a lot of work to heat up in the coming months and years. So a little bit about the literature. This isn't new. This problem of operating an SFU that wouldn't have access to packet payloads. It was examined in a paper by Hellwanger, Kushnig, Stutz, and Yule. And their angle on this was a little bit different. Here I've mostly focused on the issues of trying to, of a multi-tenant operation, making sure that different tenants are isolated. But they looked at it mostly from a performance point of view, because they wanted to figure out how to not have to decrypt and re-encrypt all these packets and do all the work. And so what they did is they did an implementation with SRTP, and they also created what they called SBVC-specific encryption, which is basically encrypting the payload field in a specific way, in which some of the null unit headers, for example, the ones that you would utilize to do the routing, were unencrypted. So think of this as kind of a variant of payload-specific encryption. And so when that packet came into the SFU, it didn't have to, it could look into the payload, figure out what was unencrypted, get the info, and not have to decrypt and re-encrypt things. In this particular research study, I believe in the SVC-specific encryption case, they did not protect the RTP headers at all, because had they used conventional SRTP, of course, they would have had to decrypt and re-encrypt things. So they did look at the resulting information leakage and some of the vulnerabilities, and found that when they did this SVC-specific stuff, it wasn't suitable for the highest level of security, because you could, of course, play games and fool around with the RTP header fields. But they did find some interesting things. They got a pretty substantial decrease in the main CPU utilization, and some decrease in the delay as well. Now, the reason that they wouldn't necessarily have seen a lot of difference in the delay is because they were still parsing the payload headers. They weren't decrypting them, but they were still essentially parsing them. And so they did not see a huge difference there, but there was a big decrease in the CPU utilization. So you can go read this paper and see all this stuff. It's about, I think, about 5 years old. So people have been thinking about this thing for quite a while. And then we have this recently submitted draft Chang, which basically proposes 2 cryptographic contexts, one for the hop by hop, which looks a lot like SRTP today, RFC 3711, and the other is a separate end-to-end context, which is used for the payload protection to the end receiver. And so the overall format looks a lot like a combination of conventional SRTP, as we have it today, with a payload-specific protection mechanism. So essentially, it's doing the encryption mechanism twice as it exists today, which maybe isn't that great, because if your payload is going to be protected, well, then you might only decide to do the payload with an authentication-only transform instead of encrypting the payload as well. So a few issues with that. But the basic idea is to combine a payload-specific protection mechanism with SRTP as it exists today. The payload-specific stuff would be end-to-end, and then the SRTP would be hop-by-hop.
Is that a little bit like EKT?
Emil?
Is that a little bit like EKT, which is the SRTP
I'll talk a little bit about EKT. EKT is solves a separate issue, which is, and let me talk a little bit about that. So one issue with the WebRTC design as it exists today is in a large conference, you'll need to negotiate different keys for each of the participants. And that adds to the cryptographic load as well, because now when a packet comes in, you need to decrypt it, as we talked about, but you also now need to re-encrypt it with different keys for each of the participants, because each of the participants has a different key. And so the problem that EKT can solve is basically allowing you to do that encryption once instead of n times for each of the participants, and using essentially getting everybody the same key. And I'll talk about why that's also very important in this case, where the SFU wouldn't have the payload-specific keys in particular, because really the only option that the SFU would have if you do what's described in draft chain is to basically forward that incoming packet really with the same payload-specific encryption, right? It doesn't have the keys, so it can't do anything else. The only other thing it could do is drop it. And so if it's forwarding that payload-specific encryption to n participants, they better all have the key or it's not going to do you a lot of good. And so as we'll talk about in a minute, EKT is a good way of potentially making sure all those participants who get that payload-specific protected payload actually can do anything with it. So what about the key management? As I've just mentioned, in this case where the SFU doesn't have the SOTP keys, it can replicate the incoming packets to the conference participant, but it can't provide them in particular with the master key necessary to decrypt the payload. As I mentioned in the draft chain proposal, there are really two encryption mechanisms, the hop by hop, which it certainly the SFU could deal with, but it doesn't have the end-to-end payload-specific one, so really can't do anything there. And so it implies the endpoints need to handle the key management for the payload-specific portion of it, and they need the same key. And DTL-SSRDP, as it exists today, wouldn't help them with that, because then they'd all have different payload-specific encryption keys, and when this thing gets replicated, it would have been encrypted with the same key for everybody. So that's an issue, and EKT, if done end-to-end, could potentially help with that. The other question this brings to mind is, well, if the payload is encrypted and the SFU can't see it, how is it going to make its routing decisions? All that information that it needs isn't going to be visible anymore. And also, the other thing is, it better not try to parse this and look for all these fields that it's looking for, because they'll all be encrypted, and anything that it would figure out, if it makes any sense at all, would be garbage. So you got to tell the SFU that you're doing this, not just send it these encrypted payloads, because it's going to barf. And you got to figure out a way to get it the information it needs to make the routing decision. So one thing that's interesting is in the UCI forum we got to talk about how, and hopefully we'll get more info on this, how the existing implementations work. And one thing we found out was some existing implementations do make forwarding and drop decisions today based on information only in the RTP header and extension fields. So they, in fact, do not decode the codec payloads. That isn't, of course, the way the standards work, but it is the way the implementations work. And the way that you do that is you take implementation info from the payload that you'd use for routing and place it into, for example, an RTP header extension. So the other question that comes out is, great, I can't read the payload, but also I can't compose my own payloads in the SFU because I don't have the keys to protect them. And there are cases where the SFU actually originates packets today. And one of those is what's called the layer drop message in H.264 SVC. So let's talk about why you use a layer drop. Well, say the SFU is getting a layer but not forwarding it to a given participant. And say that participant was getting that layer, but because of congestion or something, the SFU decided to drop it. Well, that could be a problem, potentially, particularly if you're doing the SSTSS, because now that participant is, if they don't know that they're not supposed to get that layer, they're going to start to send bogus receiver reports. So, for example, you're going to get a receiver report at your SFU, which is going to start looking like there's a lot of drops. And in particular, if you're doing SSTSS, you won't be able to distinguish drops in the different layers. And potentially the SFU could be fooled by that. And then it could drop even more layers and you could get into this death spiral. Now, if you use the SSTMS mode, that won't happen because now the SFU will see, hey, This fellow's experiencing a lot of drops, but it's on a layer that I'm not sending him anymore, so no surprise there. So that's just something to think about. So one of the questions is, hey, what can you do about this? If you can't send this layer drop message, what can you do about it? Well, the answer is it could be replaced by an equivalent RTCP message. So move it up a layer, and of course the SFU would have the RTCP key, so it could send that instead of a payload-specific message. But there is currently no proposal for exactly how to do that. So let's talk a little bit more about exactly what this approach would look like. This is a picture of the VP8 payload, and in particular we have here the VP8 payload descriptor, and that's where the information would be used by a VP8 SFU. So let's talk about what's in the VP8 packet. This is the payload descriptor. And there's a couple of fields in here that are particularly useful. One is the TID field. This is the temporal ID field, and it tells you what temporal layer we're seeing. So TID 0 would be base layer, and then the upper enhancement layers would have incremental numbers above that. In particular, also we have, when you've got the TID there, you'll typically have the L bit and the T bit set, and that means you'll get something called the TL0 pick index, and it basically tells you if the TID is greater than 0, it tells you what base layer frame the current image depends on. So you'll basically have an idea of the dependency of this particular enhancement layer packet on the base layer, which base layer frame it depends on. So this is the kind of information that you would get in an SFU if you were able to actually decrypt the payload. But because you can't, we better figure out a way of getting this into a part of the RTP packet that you can be able to look at, which would, for example, be an RTP extension. And there actually is a proposal out there. It's called Draft Feinberg AVTX Temporal Layer X, which puts some of the information from that VP8 payload descriptor into the RTP extension. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that the difference between this one and the VP8 payload descriptor is that not all the fields are actually in there. For example, the picture ID is there and the temporal ID is there, but it turns out this TL0 pick index is not there. And that may not be such a great idea because it means that you don't have all the, SFU doesn't have all the information that it would have if it could decrypt the VP8 payload. And so probably maybe a better principle would be to try to put as much of your payload descriptor info into that extension as you can to give you the flexibility and particularly the resilience features that you'd have. So what I've described here is potentially a way of doing RTP header extensions that essentially give you the same info. One thing you'll notice, though, is that this is potentially specific for each codec. And so we've had a little bit of discussion about maybe how to do this in a more general way, so that at least we cover some of the common codecs like H.264, maybe VP9, H.265, etc. So we don't continue the balkanization that we've had, and maybe make it a bit easier to do, make that SFU somewhat more codec independent. And that's one of the tasks that I think we need to think about more, in addition to working on things like the feedback messages. So the final part of this is to talk about some of the pieces that are missing from WebRTC to enable us to use this simulcast and scalable video coding technology. So we've talked about how potentially this is going in a direction that might make it more interoperable than it's been before, and allow it to be more usable by WebRTC, so you can build backends that can handle all the different codecs that WebRTC would use. But there's still a remaining issue, which is how do you utilize this in your WebRTC application? What do you do? What are the APIs that allow you to build WebRTC apps that use scalable video coding and simulcast? And it's a pretty desirable thing. I think Emil can speak to this, because if you're writing a WebRTC app, and you might write that on the web, or you might take your WebRTC stack and build a mobile app, you probably want that app to be usable by a variety of clients. For example, you'd want a mobile app, mobile user, smartphone user, be able to participate in the conference, telepresence user, maybe someone on a PC, maybe someone on a tablet. All those folks could be showing up into this conference. In fact, any of them might be watching this VOC right now, and so you'd want to make sure they all can get the video and have a decent experience. And so for that, simulcast and scalable video coding are pretty desirable things to support. So Robin, feel free to chime in here. Really the way to do this is what we call object RTC. What is it? Well, one way to describe it is it's the future of WebRTC, and not necessarily the very distant future, because we have partial support coming in WebRTC 1.0. There was a recent announcement, and I don't want to necessarily speak for Google, but they did talk about potentially implementing this starting in Chrome 38 and Chrome 39. And there's a nice presentation which was used at the interim meeting of the WebRTC working group where they described how all this would be interfaced to the WebRTC 1.0 spec. And the basic idea is you begin to see these objects, like a sender object, receiver object, ICE transport object, and DTLS transport object. In 1.0, you still have to use SDP for negotiating features, but not all aspects of simulcast and SVC need to be negotiated. So, for example, what simulcast is, as I described, is it's an end host sending multiple streams, and so you could, in SDP, you can describe that as multiple M lines. Today in SDP, there isn't a good way of saying those M lines are grouped, that is, they represent a simulcast. But essentially, that could be an app-specific thing. You just put multiple M lines in, send this to the SFU, and the SFU kind of knows that, hey, these aren't different cameras. They're really the same thing. Basically, in your app logic, you could do this maybe over the data channel or maybe in a separate signaling mechanism that you define. And so there's kind of enough in SDP as it exists to send the multiple streams. And then SDP also allows you, of course, in a single M line to potentially receive one of multiple payload types. And so you can basically do it within SDP as you have it today. The other thing is that scalable video coding need not necessarily be negotiated in SDP. That's not true for all codecs. It probably isn't true for H.264 SVC. But for VP8, one of the things about VP8 is that a decoder can decode anything that an encoder can send. That's a requirement of VP8. And that includes potentially the use of temporal scalability. So it's in temporal scalability is a basic element of the VP8 spec. As I mentioned, it isn't turned on right now within most existing implementations, but it could be. And it's essentially only an encoder setting. So the encoder can decide, hey, I want to do temporal scalability, send multiple layers. And there's no permission that it needs from the decoder. The decoder just deals with it. And so because of this, it is possible to get partial support for these technologies in WebRTC 1.0 through use of these objects. Now that you get the complete object model in what's called ORTC 1.1, and that's a much richer set of controls with no SDP, no SDP offer-answer state machine. You get potentially very detailed layering control of both simulcast and scalable video coding. The philosophy is to start with a basic API, improving later as we understand things better, and supporting everything that's in WebRTC 1.0, so you're not dropping features in ORTC, and also to have backward compatibility with WebRTC 1.0. Now, of course, if you have a 1.0 implementation that adds support for ORTC, you have that kind of baked in. But if you do only ORTC, there is this concept of a shim that essentially exposes the WebRTC 1.0 API on top of ORTC. So it's not like you're losing anything. You still get to potentially run your WebRTC 1.0 apps, but if you want the new stuff, then you need to support ORTC as well.
Do you mind if I drop in here for a minute?
Would love to have you take over and talk more.
I think the important key message here is that ORTC is a lower, not low level, lower level API than WebRTC 1.0 API. And it's a pipelining-based API and a do-as-I-say API, meaning that you can set up how your transport and your DTLS and your RTP all go together, as well as to say exactly the type of encoding you want to do for your packets. And you do all this in ORTC. And then the WebRTC API is a negotiation API with the SDP style syntax going on. And that can exist on top of the ORTC API as a JavaScript shim. So anybody who implements ORTC will be able to take that shim and put it on top of the ORTC API and therefore get a WebRTC 1.0 style API as well. So you get both worlds at the same time. So that's an important consideration. Why it's important in the case of SFUs and SVCs is because it's a very low-level do-as-I-say API, so controlling your base layer and your encoding and everything else is extremely simple. You just set up the structures, and the engine just says, okay, I will do exactly what you say, and go ahead. Whereas when you're dealing with negotiation, you're kind of, you know, you're taking a sledgehammer trying to hit it and hoping it does what you want, as opposed to doing, you know, taking fine-tooth tools and tooling exactly what you want.
Yeah, and actually, even more importantly for this, because there is no SDP definition for how to do simulcast and a lot of missing parts for the SVC thing, really SDP isn't really an option. There is no SDP, for example, to set up simulcast today. There's no standard for that. And many of the, for example, the SSDMS mode has no SDP. There's no definition for that. So in fact, SDP really can't even be used.
I presume that they will eventually solve that issue by putting in the correct formats and description. It's an extendable descriptive language, so eventually they'll have the definitions. But for now, with a direct API, you can say encode it exactly this way, and that's what ORTC does.
Yeah. So my anticipation is that the way this would be done in 1.0 would be basically having most of it done in the ORTC itself. Like I said, the SDP is only used for negotiated features, and for VP8 you don't need to negotiate SVC. And you really don't even need to negotiate the simulcast. You can just have it as separate M lines with the app layer, understanding what's going on there. So hopefully they can get this done without actually having to develop SDP standards for simulcast and SVC, which would delay it longer than anybody's willing to wait. Let's put it that way.
Bernard, you can probably go over to live video now for the end, unless you have other slides to show.
Just have two more. This is a picture of what it looks like in WebRTC 1.0. This is from Justin Uberti's presentation to the WebRTC group. And basically what we see is that you have these sender and receiver objects in addition to the RTC peer connection from WebRTC 1.0. One of the other benefits, by the way, is you get per track control, and instead of media stream control, which is what we have in WebRTC 1.0. So you get some nice stuff there. And this is a comparison of the ORTC architecture where you have all of the objects. For example, you get control over the ICE transport, DTLS transport, SCTP with the data channel, and all of that. So it's a much richer construct, and you don't need the SDP at all, either for negotiated or unnegotiated features. And a final plug for the ORTC community, if you want to get active in that, understand what's going on with it, keep on top of things. It's out there. It's part of the W3C community group. You can go to ortc.org, and that's a landing page for all things ORTC. You can get specs, links to community group. There'll be some open source projects getting underway to do this. The next major milestone is what we call a call for implementation. Hopefully we can get that started soon. And then a plug for some of the people who have been helpful here. Of course, Robin and Hope Flash, really the founders of this, and have led the developing and editing and the specification and the open source work. Versatic and TurboBridge are some of the co-authors of it. Google's contributed to the overall design and the plan for compatibility with 1.0, and Microsoft, of course, follows and contributes to this, and particularly the advanced video features, which are of a lot of interest to us, since all our products depend on that. And then the MS OpenTech folks have been doing prototyping to demonstrate the promise and some of the issues in the specs, and so they're helping out as well.
Okay, and I think Eric Lagerwey is in the IRC in any case, and he's been posting some links. As I said, I posted the link on Google Plus to the mailing list and to a couple other things. This is just so inspiring that everybody gets together. Bernard, if you want to put your video back on, just
Yeah.
to
So
say
let me
goodbye.
figure out how to do this.
I know it's a major technical challenge, but I'm sure you're up there.
How do I unscreen share myself?
It's just a toggle. It's a toggle.
It's a toggle.
You press the screen share again.
Click the same thing again, and it'll stop.
Did it stop?
Yeah, you have to go over to the left side of the Hangout thing, which supposedly is no longer a plugin. But anyway, there's a menu there, and you just click that same thing again.
Okay. Well, let me get rid of this stuff.
Okay, while you're doing that, I'm going to ask for any. First of all, thanks, Robin, for joining us, of course, too, and your additions. You guys are welcome anytime. Thanks for Emil for thinking of this whole thing, and also like to ask for any questions. And of course, Carl's question moves to the last, just in case there aren't any others. But if anybody's got any questions on ZipDX or on the IRC channel, which I'm looking at right now.
I'd actually like to start while people are getting ready with their questions.
Yeah.
So,
sure.
First of all, this has been an incredibly informative presentation. I'm probably going to bookmark it and send it to everyone who joins the Jitsi team as a tutorial about all the problems that need to be solved. But basically, to sum it up, and Bernard, please let me know if you agree. So the SFU is something that makes video conferencing available to everyone, because for years we've had video conferencing, but it has been going through mixers that have been very expensive and without even giving you the particularly awesome quality, unless it's really, really expensive. And now with an SFU, it becomes such a simple affair that you can put it on your own server or on your own VM in a cloud that you pay $5 a month or something like that, and then everyone can just use it, and it can go as Bernard summarized, it can go beyond that. It can actually become the conferencing server can become an actual router if we just do a couple of more little steps and make it easier for SFUs not to need to decrypt all the traffic that's going through them, and basically just be able to relay it. And then, as Bernard explained, this is different. The possibility not to need to decrypt media is different from the possibility to actually decrypt it. So these are two different problems because with one, the SFU can still be exposed to the keys, and it could still be used for legal interception and that kind of stuff, or actually for things like recording and conferences like what we're doing here. So it could be legitimate purposes as well. But in certain cases, you would want to you would want to be sure that no one can decrypt your conference, even the actual conferencing server. And this is probably the finest step, the final step that needs to be taken by the technologies that we're working on, so that we can have truly trustable conferences. And my first question here would be, Bernard, if you had to wager, how would you put that in years? When would you say the first step would be possible with WebRTC, and when do you think the second step would be possible? So again, the first step is truly efficient SFUs that don't decrypt, although they could, and then just round traffic. And then the second step is SFUs that are not only efficient, that can actually be trusted because they don't have access to your keys.
First of all, Emil, I'd like to thank you for summarizing that distinction between an SFU that can't decrypt traffic and one that has the keys but doesn't want to use them for efficiency reasons. And I would love it if you could, at the ITF meeting coming up when they get into this discussion, try to hammer that distinction home, because I'm not sure some of the drafts really understand the difference. But as I said today, when we were in the UCI forum discussing how existing SFUs work, we found at least one implementation that does not decrypt the packet payload. And it was doing it, I believe, for largely efficiency reasons, because they didn't want the decrypt-encrypt operation. So There are SFUs today that do this, not using standards, of course, but they do it. And we did have this proposal for this draft Feinberg thing, which was, I think, also for the purpose of saving the encrypt-decrypt operations. The problem with the proposal is it didn't succeed because if that, as we discussed, if that implementation touched any of the headers, then it would have to do the decrypt-encrypt operation anyway. And so, people weren't sure it was that helpful. So what we see in practice is, I believe that the implementations out there which don't decrypt the payload also have to do some of this payload-specific encryption. The two have to go together to really get the efficiency gains, which was, I think, the main focus of the existing implementations. To answer your question, Emil, I think that the RTP header extensions are something that, like I say, I believe they are being done today in practice, and people are very willing to propose to do them. The trickier part of it is actually dealing with the SRTP such that when you can touch the packet header but not have to decrypt and re-encrypt. And some of the proposals we've seen, like I've said, most of them don't tackle that part of it successfully. In fact, Draft Chang, really what it does is it encrypts things twice, one end-to-end and one hop-by-hop. So it doesn't really solve the efficiency problem that you were talking about unless you use an authentication-only transform, which, in my opinion, would make sense in that context because the payload is encrypted. So why would you have to encrypt it twice? So that's, I think, the one which will have a little bit longer discussion. But really, we're not talking about changing SRTP. I think that's an important point. At least Draft Chang isn't, right, and some of the research isn't. It's only about really talking about the payload-specific encryption mechanism.
Right. Let me interject something here. This is really funny because I'm talking to Andy. I thought maybe this was me, but we're getting like really weird frame rates. And Bernard, I was seeing a static image. You still showing, as far as I can tell?
I'm still showing it. I'm sorry, I didn't figure out how to get the video back.
No, but that's okay. But you know what? You're not even showing what I'm seeing coming back from Google, and I'm saying this for a reason. It seems that whatever infrastructure we're using from Google was suddenly transforming you into a still image. In other words, your avatar or your ID photo, and so it wasn't even showing the slide. And Emil is coming through at a frame rate of like 1 frame a second. And now that I've confirmed that it isn't just me, I don't know, Robin, what are you seeing over there?
Yeah, I'm seeing the similar thing. I see his slides in very, very slow frame rates from most people, except for you. You're reasonable.
So now I'm back. I think I'm back without.
Yes, you are.
I'm back with video, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
anyway, it's a little odd, but this is all where we're all coming from different points, and we're going through the Google infrastructure, which is usually good. But I just want to mention that, and Michael's saying Emil was on poor bandwidth last week. Emil, where are you? In France now? You are, right?
I am. Yes.
So for those of you who
I'm
don't
on a
know,
fiber connection. So this is actually I see the low frame rate on my computer as well. So it
and
seems
you're on
to
a
be
fiber.
That. Yeah.
Well, if we were on Jitsi, we'd be perfect because we'd be using.
It would be, yes, but
let's try to make that happen soon.
we are. Bernard, you mentioned that the technology is there, but don't you? How hard do you think it would be for the WebRTC client vendors to adopt that? Because everyone is so happy about WebRTC, including us, actually, because it just takes a huge load off of the implementers because they don't have to worry that much about the clients anymore. They can concentrate on server technology or on JavaScript applications. But then the problem is that every time you need something added to that base client technology, you're in kind of a pickle because you have to convince these big corporations to adopt it, and they have their own priorities, and it's not easy. So, in particular concerning encryption, how likely do you think it is for them to adopt such things as EKT or something similar?
Yeah, it's a great question, Emil. I have said that we've been in the UCI forum. We've been looking at this for a while, and But the thing that's interesting is the amount of interest now in the IETF in this. As I've said, there were 3 drafts in the last week. And so I've heard from maybe 5, 6 different vendors that they want to fix this. So I would have told you a month ago, not a lot of chance, but now the level of interest is pretty darn high. So I guess you'll see at IETF 90 in Toronto how much progress we make. But I would say that that there's certainly a higher chance of this getting fixed than there ever has been before, definitely. And the biggest worry I have actually isn't about the SRTP stuff at all. It's about the hurting all the codec cats. As we've said, there's a lot of things you have to do to get this to work really well. Not only just the encryption stuff, but also you have to have more commonality in the use of the feedback messages. The codecs have to define these extension headers and get that act together. And that's the part I worry about in particular, because things like HEVC are using a different set of feedback messages than what was defined in the RTP usage profile. And then we're also seeing people going off and doing H.264 implementations with their own set of feedback messages. So I think what we've got to think about for WebRTC isn't just the RTP usage document, but kind of enforcing that down into the codec implementers so that they don't kind of destroy all the nice profiling that we did in WebRTC by doing their own thing as they have been doing for a long time. So we need a little bit more discipline overall than we've had. And of course, enforcing discipline on a bunch of cats is kind of hard. I'm a cat owner, so that's really and that's kind of a realm.
Right.
Okay, round of final questions from anybody?
Whenever you're ready, Randy.
Go, go, Carl.
Okay. So I guess my question is fairly simple and high level. My question is, all standards-based, communications and specs and things like that, they all have, to some degree, the problems you're describing, where there's just sort of the in service of flexibility and in service of adaptability, you end up with these. All of the problems you're describing. I won't go. Everybody already understands these issues, and so what often happens is a private solution that has more definitive control over all the elements in the equation. In other words, where they shoot all the cats but one. They come in and they're able to sometimes perform and solve the technology problems better than open standards. And so my question is specific to that. What is the probability that some walled garden like Flash plugins or some other single vendor solution will essentially come in and fill the niche that this is trying to fill, because of the fact that the problem of hurting the cats is just so intractable that it may not happen to satisfaction before someone else can come in and deal with it. If you recall, a great example of this would be just video over the web. There were so many standards, and then when Flash came in, and sort of the kind of the collision of Flash and YouTube sort of made it so that everybody had the right coder. The coder was appropriately licensed. They sort of solved some of the DRM problems to a high enough degree to satisfy the rights holders. And so what happened was an explosion of video on the internet that couldn't have happened previous to that. So I guess my question is, can you speak to that in some high level?
Sure.
I know
that's a great question, because having gone through this cat herding for 3 years and largely failed in the UCI forum, I would certainly say that what you're saying certainly describes the way things have worked, throughout time. So, if the existing status quo were to continue, it would pretty much be along the lines you described. But I do have a little bit of hope because of the way WebRTC changes things. So the first thing is that I think of WebRTC in many ways as both an API, but also a set of protocols, and the set of protocols are being pretty widely adopted. We're seeing WebRTC go into a lot of native mobile apps and, of course, web apps. And the numbers, if you look at it, potentially, are pretty huge compared to the existing deployments of video. So if you were to add up all the existing telepresence systems and mobile video stuff and compare that to WebRTC, WebRTC potentially gets you another order of magnitude. And so it has the ability, and we've already seen this, to create pressures for interoperability which didn't exist. So in the existing video world, really none of the existing vendors have more than, say, 20% market share. Nobody's dominant, so there's really interoperability becomes a huge problem because you get all of this fragmentation. That's not as likely to occur in WebRTC, where if you take the top 3 browsers, that's 70–80% of all the browser market. So there's fewer cats to herd, and also in the web, there's kind of this expectation of interoperability. I mean, it's of course not been perfect by any means, but I think the trend has been towards more interoperability rather than less. Today, if you look at the major browsers, you also get a lot of negative feedback from developers if you don't have interoperability. So I'd say the pressure there in the web world is a lot greater than it was in the video telepresence world, where interoperability has been limited. Of course, corporate customers in particular are not very happy about that, but it's kind of persisted, as you said. Whereas in the web world, people just kind of don't have have a lot lower tolerance for that kind of thing. And that doesn't mean that you won't get people doing their own thing as well, but I think that the pressure for some kind of interoperability is going to be pretty intense. And so I can't, I think that's the difference that may give us a little bit more hope here.
And I would add, Bernard, that even if you fail, or we fail, so to speak, to come up with this commonality that does work, and it ends up being that someone does solve it, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because there's nothing like having someone beat out the marketplace, adding competitive pressure for all the enemies, so to speak, or the other competing companies to come together and agree upon standards. So if you end up with somebody winning as a result, you'll see all the competitors come together and decide, okay, we're going to come together now, even though we wouldn't before. So again, I don't even think that's a bad thing. Yeah,
I will say though that I don't think that winner could win by doing plugins, because that's the problem that WebRTC is trying to solve. Right. So the plugin world is kind of, I'd say the days of the plugin are numbered, particularly when we're seeing the NPA API deprecation by Firefox and Chrome. I think people are very cognizant of the limitations of plugins, and I don't think that's kind of a lot of the motivation for WebRTC is kind of to dump that. So, I don't think that would be a likely winner.
We also have to.
I would also suggest maybe, and tell me what you think of this, that if there is, a single vendor plugin type solution that happens in the interim, kind of to Robin's point, I mean, again, the video example, Flash, enabled the development of video on the online, and then of course it was essentially, once the market was established, then then essentially there was more cake to go around, and so it, like you said, it drove, it created a lot of competitive pressure, and it caused everyone to come together, and now we have things like H.264, HTML5, and so perhaps that would be exactly what would happen in the world of RTC.
Yeah, I think what we are seeing, though, it is fair to say, an explosion in cloud video conferencing. A lot of vendors in that space, and many of those vendors handle a lot of these interop problems, like they'll do transcoding, or they'll handle all these different formats. So it's still possible, even if all this great stuff doesn't happen at the browser level, it's still possible to compensate for it in the cloud. So that's also something to keep in mind, is that a cloud video conferencing system could, hopefully without too much violating some of the principles we talked about, fix some of this stuff. Like I said, you want to do it as a higher level as possible, so hopefully you don't have to do transcoding, but maybe just repacketizing things in transports and stuff like that.
And we do have to remember, though, that when we're talking about WebRTC, we shouldn't just be talking about browsers, even though it's a browser technology. There is a huge, huge marketplace for mobile phones. More and more people are using that as their, primary device for interfacing the web these days, and just using their computers as secondary when they need, more screen real estate to use. So I think it's important to remember that there will be a lot of technologies that are coming out there that aren't necessarily browser-based. They're actually native applications that might even have the WebRTC engine behind the scenes. So having extensions and plugins there is a possibility, even for the short term. So that's where you could possibly see the competitive pressure come out. regarding enhanced solutions when you're on mobile or when you're on these different platforms, and just going back to a baseline level when you're talking to a WebRTC implementation. But I think it's going to create the pressure, and it's going to come into the browser eventually, even if it doesn't end up existing there immediately.
Right. You're sort of describing the opposite of a plugin, where instead of having, you know, proprietary code snap into a standard framework, i.e. a browser, you're talking about having, you know, a proprietary, you know, code like an app essentially snap in to web interop technology.
Yeah. The other thing to mention, I think that's worth mentioning, is that you know, simplicity often is a good thing when trying to get some of these advanced functionalities in there, and you know, as we've talked about, in particular, things like VP8, you know, they don't necessarily have all the functionality of some of the advanced H.264 scalable video coding implementations, but you can get a basic simulcast. In fact, simulcast really you can do with any codec, right? It's just something, and that gives you some basic functionality, ability to do frame rate or spatial simulcast. That's something that you will get really with any codec, and so if you have any basic WebRTC interop, you can basically do that in the very near future. And then things like turning on temporal scaling in VP8 will give you significant advantages as well. And as I said, the code is already in the browser, so all you need is an API, which is basically what ORTC gives you, to control it. So I would say that, you know, if you're talking about every feature we've described being enabled and interoperable, that might be a long haul. But basically, being able to do the most basic things, simulcast, temporal scaling, I think there's quite a bit of hope that you'll be able to do that and have at least some degree of interoperability in the near future. So if we keep our, you know, as people like to say, the most important thing about being happy is resetting your expectations. Don't set them too high, and just deal with what you get. You know, you'll find yourself with an increasing array of options in the fairly near future because of ORTC.
You know, I'd like to chime in here for a second because I'm not that technical, and this has been a fantastic presentation with so much depth, so much over my head and maybe over some people's heads. But what's important, Bernard and Robin et al., if you will, is that if you recall why Skype was important at all, it was because you just, you know, installed the thing and it worked. The recent, and I've said this a million times, the recent cry that, yeah, WebRTC doesn't need a plugin. Well, that's fantastic, except it only works in Chrome. The problem really always is going to come back to adoption and the clickable link that anyone, your grandmother, your grandmother's stepmother, you know, anybody can click on. And we're still, I think we're still a ways from that. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly are, but I think the trend is fairly clear, which is that WebRTC has made a difference. It is exerting pressures on interoperability that didn't exist before. So if you're in the cat herding business, which is kind of what me and Robin do, the cats used to not care at all what you told them. Even if you didn't give them the food, they probably didn't care. They go find other food. But now they seem to care a little bit more. So that's one thing that you notice. And I think it has made a difference. It's created expectations in areas such as the feedback messages, which were hopeless before, and now we have a little guidance. Of course, not everyone listens to the standards, but at least we have somebody saying this is what you ought to do, and it is the RTP profile is a pretty reasonable set of expectations about what modern systems could function as. So I think we're moving in a good direction, and I think, as we've said, you will start to see things if you're a developer that will be useful to you by the end of the year. So. You know, good things are happening. Not necessarily everything we discuss will happen immediately, but you know, we have to live with the progress we get, and that's discernible.
If I might plug ORTC again, I think that's why everybody who's interested in making sure that we're interoperable should be part of the ORTC work community group, rather, and so that you know, we can create this momentum around having compatibility. Because ORTC is very much focused on the scalable video codec, and one of the use cases we had from the start was making sure that the SFU was compatible. And I know for myself and others were very concerned about this encryption problem and making sure that we didn't have to have keys on the SFU and stuff like that. So these are some of the primary concerns. So make sure you are part of this community so that we can create momentum behind it and get it out there.
Yeah, in particular, when we issue that call for implementations, we very much love to have people apply ORTC to different codecs. VP8, plug it in, try it with H.264. I should mention that the Open H.264 codec from Cisco does support scalable video coding in the encoder. If you look at it, it supports temporal scalability and simulcast. So basically, and VP8, as I mentioned, has temporal scaling in it. It's not enabled at the moment. So there is code out there. If you're going to implement ORTC, there is the underlying stuff to basically exercise the features that we've got in there. So you don't have to go build your own encoder to decoder. It's out. The code's out there to do it.
No question, there's amazing stuff happening, and I certainly didn't mean to say otherwise. Thanks, everybody.
Can I ask one question? I'm one last question, Carl.
Of course, Carl.
That's my whole reputation. Yeah. So you mentioned this problem of having the SVC, not have essentially, you've got this encryption problem, and you don't want to have these shared keys. And as you were describing that, the first thing that came to mind was something like perfect forward security, where you essentially use the assertion of the one to make sure that the dynamic ephemeral keys for the those are the ones that that are the ones that matter for that session. So can you speak to that a little bit as to
Sure. If you've been following the WebRTC list, you'll notice that the newest security architecture document indicates a preference for PFS, perfect forward secrecy, in media path. So that's definitely a concern people have had. They want to move towards PFS. That's going to require adoption of DTLS 1.2, which people are pushing into the WebRTC implementations. Currently, I think the mandate is you have to do at least 1.0 with a recommendation of 1.2. And so there will also be a recommendation to implement the perfect forward secrecy cipher suites. So that's definitely something which we should see coming into browsers in the very near future. I think everyone understands that PFS is important, and they need to do it and need to support go to DTLS 1.2 for that. But I would mention actually one important thing is that DTLS sRGP, which is the way we negotiate the cipher suites for the media, it is possible to support cipher suites even if they're not supported in DTLS itself, because it's two separate negotiations. So anyway, I think that's very well understood that we need to do that for enhanced security. Not a lot of argument about that. And there's folks pretty much working on it now.
Does that still leave things on the table?
Well, one of the wonderful things about security is there's always things that are left on the table, particularly in conferencing, I think it's important to understand that even if the SFU doesn't have the keys, so that you don't have your threat within the SFU, there's always, in conferencing by nature, everyone who's in the conference has to get the video. So, if one of those participants isn't trusted, you've got yourself a problem. And of course, if some bogus person wants to join and record it, that's a different set of threats, which really has very little to do with cryptography.
Right.
So I think we do have to have a reasonable understanding about what threats can be solved and not solved. And certainly the bogus participant isn't one of those. If someone wants to, get on and secretly records the video that's coming out, this isn't going to solve that portion of it.
Right, right.
So I think as Emil said, it's important to distinguish the two aspects, which is not wanting to have to decrypt the payload because it's just a performance headache, and not having the ability to do it, which is the secondary thing.
Right.
So does that mean you're satiated, Carl?
I am. Yeah, I am. Although I can think of some really clever solutions to that bogus participant problem. That's funny. It seems like Papa Smurf and Santa are on the call. Were they invited? Like you have this perfect, call it a CAPTCHA test, right? Like the moving form of someone you know. Right,
or obviously in this VUC, right? We know who's in it at the moment, but it's going to be put up on the web, and 1 million people can view it, and not much we can do about that. That's kind of the intent of it. So.
Right. Good stuff. Thanks for putting up with all my fuzzy questions.
Oh, on the contrary, you're a feature, not a bug, Carl. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your participation. Bernard and Robin and Emil, thanks for suggesting the topic. Michael, thanks for everything you do. Andy, too. And anyone else who's listening, you guys and gals, probably, are the core of the VUC. We really appreciate it. And now we're going to move to the mature audiences version. Here we go.